Good morning from London. On behalf of the Goethe Institute London and everyone involved, I'm very excited to welcome you yet again from all around the world to the DAO sessions Artworld Prototypes. This is the fourth online event to discover a new set of experimental projects to reinvent the future of the art world with blockchain by investigating what can be learned from DAOs, Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, working with others. Each event introduces one of 5 new progressive blockchain art prototypes created by DAO teams in Berlin, Hong Kong, Johannesburg, and Minsk as part of a large international collaboration of the last 18 months. Each session aims to address key questions about the potential of blockchain systems to decentralize power structures and to rewire the arts. I want to use this moment to thank everyone involved who has been working tirelessly in the different cities during this exciting endeavor, and especially today, the team from Hong Kong. In order to include the widest audience possible, we are pleased to welcome Kat, who will be translating today's event into British Sign Language, and we will be using visual descriptions, which means any presenter will describe themselves and any image they use. So I'm Katrine and I have dark hair and I'm wearing a black dress today. And as mentioned, we have Kat here with us who has blonde hair and has a blue top. Please do post any questions you have in the Q&A section and our hosts will ensure that they get heard and discussed by our presenters. If you do not want to say your name in relation to a question you post in the Q&A section, please do state so when asking the question. I will now hand over to Ruth Catlow, Artistic Director of Furtherfield, and Penny Rafferty, writer and researcher, who are the curators and hosts of the DAO sessions Artworld Prototypes. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Katrin. So I'm Ruth. Hello, everyone. I'm a white woman with my dark brown hair tied back in a green hoodie and wearing glasses. Today we're here to meet the Ensemble DAO prototype crew, created in Hong Kong. Penny and I are going to start with an intro to the series and a short explainer about DAOs and what they bring to the art world. Then we'll meet the Ensemble crew who will present their DAO interspersed with questions from you and some conversation with Penny and I. So DAOs are automated organizations, a new way of working to pool and distribute resources collectively, benefiting from new trust and verification systems, blockchain-based funding, member anonymity, transparent governance, and translocal partnerships. In previous sessions, we've invited people to think of Artworld DAOs as executable artists' manifestos, co-owned organizations to make operations and value flows in Artworld ecosystems more transparent. Last time we talked about Artworld DAOs as the autopoetic, many-headed hydra, able to reproduce and maintain itself without a single point of failure or control, for better or for worse. And today, we invite you to think of DAOs as the dance floors where we gather with friends and strangers to test out our new moves, coordinating to new rhythms to form fluid dance troupes, complex, social, living beings before rational economic decision makers. To reflect on the importance of pre-DAO work, to discover the new norms for now and the patterns to cultivate, record and reuse with whom and in what places. Along with our feminist, economic and commons idols, we know that for life to thrive, infrastructure must follow culture, not the other way round. And now I'm going to hand us over to Penny Rafferty.
Thank you, Ruth. So I just want to very briefly sort of unpack some of the work that we've been doing and really the kind of modules that brought us to this project. So the kind of aims of these presentations is to share and exchange knowledge about the genesis, processes and results of the 2020 Artworld DAO prototype development. We started this project because we knew it was important for us to begin to think in radical terms about interdependent models of working and how do artists become the key holders of their own working practices rather than being buffered by archaic gatekeepers. Today, art has changed. In fact, art will always change. That is the social evolution of art. But the architecture of the art world and institutions seems never to adapt as readily as art, which is why we begin to create this network of DAOs. This is not to say that the art world doesn't have any radical friends inside it. Of course it does, which is also why we are here today, thankfully. But changing the system from the inside out is a highly disputed practice with its roundabouts of wins and losses. And so building a new habitat seemed to be the only option. One world that is still being expanded upon and not yet totally drenched in gentrified, demarcated amphitheaters is the digital world. And so we began to explore the code of distribution, legacy, and aid through technological modes of community structuring via the blockchain. These exercises allowed us to gain valuable and insightful reflection space, discussion, and knowledge about how to tackle living and making together, both on a physical and code plane. Working with our peers meant getting the right people in the room, which has also allowed us to think about how blockchain enables new forms of cooperation in and across localities as an extension of the human mind when it comes to care as governance, and as an extension of the moving body, as Ruth just quite beautifully outlined, and how restructuring power as empowerment can give new values to already imaginative, groundbreaking works. This is crucial in thinking about how to move forward as a core understanding what needs to be decentralized and what needs to have fluid guardianship. And lastly, how to see technology as a proxy of care, security, and distribution. How do we create the environments we want to live in, rather than the battlefields we survive inside? I've been thinking of the sci-fi writer Octavia E. Butler's technique of cautionary tales in relation to the practice of building DAOs. Using speculative models to start the uprising of reality is a tool that is needed right now. And I think Ensemble is one of the projects that will really lead us into this on both a practical and a social level.
Thanks, Penny. So now we are to hand over to today's Artworld DAO prototype, Ensemble. Multidisciplinary and award-winning artist Samson Young was trained as a composer and holds a PhD in music composition. Among many notable achievements, in 2017, he represented Hong Kong in a solo project at the Hong Kong Pavilion of the 57th Venice Biennale. Dr. Massimiliano Molana teaches anthropology at Goldsmiths College and is interested in the relationship between art and political economy. His practice engages pedagogy, art, and activism, and he has co-initiated organizations and initiatives like the Institute of Radical Imagination and the Laboratory of Urban Commons that both take art as a form of political prefiguration. Meta Objects is a studio based in Hong Kong that facilitates digital production with artists and cultural institutions. And today we have Meta Objects co-founders, technical director Andrew Crow, who's a technologist and software engineer with over 15 years of commercial experience working in London, and artistic director Ashley Lee Wong, curator and researcher with over 10 years of experience in the arts and cultural sector in the UK and Hong Kong. She worked as head programs and operations at Sedition, the London-based online platform for distributing digital limited editions by contemporary artists. So the Ensemble team today will present in two parts. So do pose any questions from the get-go so that we can start to address them as part of the conversation in the middle of the session. And we'll try and address all of your questions and fold in the things that you're bringing up into the wider conversation. So over to you, Samson, if you would like to start by describing yourself.
Thank you, everyone. I'm Samson. I'm an Asian today I'm wearing a green sweatshirt and I wear glasses, black hair. Let me just quickly start my share screen. So I'm one member of Ensemble. Ensemble is the four of us. Although we are each also an individual within Ensemble, and we are taking this opportunity to think with and through the possibility of DAO from each of our own perspective. Ensemble has a history of development that started with Claire, Ruth, and Penny's invitation, which came in the form of a briefing pack through Claire. On screen, I'm showing a kind of a drawing. There's some orange on the right, and then there's a yellow grid on the upper left-hand corner, and a triangular shape that connects several more abstract shapes. In May last year, there was an effort to bring together many music-related arts organizations in Hong Kong. In addition, also Onion Lai, Lo Lai Lai, and Michael Leung into a conversation focusing on the DAO. On screen, we have a green and blue grid, some orange cloud shapes, cloud-like shapes, and DAO written on the top left-hand corner. In July last year, there was a Zoom conversation that happened that was led by Claire, and the 8 groups of participants, including, at that point, I was representing contemporary music in Hong Kong, which is a local art group that I have been directing. On screen, you see a cluster of yellow and a grid of green and yellow in the top half of the page, and then a cloud of orange and gray and more orange shapes scattered throughout the page. And then in August, then two subgroups started to form, which is Debbie Blockchain, another Hong Kong group, and Ensemble. At that point, the members of the Ensemble stabilized, the 4 of us, and the name of the group Ensemble was created by Ashley and agreed with by the members of the group. On screen, you see the text that's a line of text that says forking with a circle that went 2 directions, a purple circle, half circle in the middle of the page, and some grid-like object on the right-hand side of the page that says packing. In earnest, we started discussing seriously what we would like to focus on in Ensemble in September last year. And the Ensemble project started with a focus on more formal and structured organizational types. But it slowly, through the contribution of all members, evolved into thinking about informal and improvisational collaboration with quite a different focus. On screen, we see many lines of purple, some shapes of green, of blue that are pointing to each other, and some more cloud-like shapes that are living outside of these purple lines. So I want to very briefly talk about DAO and multidisciplinary collaboration, and from one personal perspective, what might the relationship be? Where might the sort of the overlap be? So I'm going to very briefly talk about the perspective from my own practice, and then from the perspective of a multidisciplinary art organization, Contemporary Music Hong Kong. So from my own practice, there are works where I collaborate with people, and at the beginning, at the beginning of the collaboration, usually before people enter into the collaboration, there is a conversation about sharing. But over time, as the work develops and as the work gets screened, played, or appears in exhibition across spaces, then the sharing of value over time is usually managed by the artists, and this creates an administrative problem and also an issue of trust, what Mao would describe as a kind of cognitive dissonance. There's also the issue of evolution of role over time. An artist's role evolves from at the beginning as a grant writer to the artist and a participator in the project, and later on across time and space becoming the manager of the project and also managing sharing over time. And these are different kinds of labors that sometimes are not thought about. From an organizational perspective, we also see that the way we think about multidisciplinary collaboration can sometimes yield a predictable result, even when you bring people together. So a large part of what Contemporary Music in Hong Kong does is actually bringing people who are working in technology together with artists who might not be so familiar with technology. We do several things, but in the context of this presentation, I want to focus on one program of ours, which started in 2015 and have continued till today. In this particular instance, in 2017 and 18, we brought together percussionist Louis Seal and his two-box percussion ensemble. We matched him up with Joseph Chen, who's a local robotic artist and technologist with his own very active practice as an installation artist. And we, as the organization, function as the facilitator, bringing people together, as well as the grant writer and funder of the project. And this is the result of the work that Joseph and Louis made together. What we have noticed, however, is that although we were very pleased with the collaboration, and it always is something that enriches both the technologist and the musician, because of the way the relationship is conceived in terms of who is teaching technology and who's learning the technology, and because technology is the new element that is being born into the artistic field, and therefore that is thought of as the sort of the teaching entity. So we feel like over different collaborations, the outcome retains a certain shape and consistency in a kind of outcome that we could come to expect. So there's also thinking about whether if a collaboration is more fluid, whether there might be opportunity for outlets at different points, so that the artist is not the only front-facing an outlet, a front-facing aspect of the collaboration and the only outlet, but the technologist and the artist and even the facilitator or other collaborators could also have their own front-facing aspect of this collaboration that is fluid. So in our conversation that has evolved, we started thinking about fixed roles versus action performed. So instead of thinking of people in collaboration as artists, instrument builders, theorists, etc., we simply think of action types and also the outcome of these actions. The other consideration, which I'm sure Ashley and Mel will be able to speak more about, is moving from a more formal structure to a informal sort of collaboration, from a scored structure that came maybe from singular or condensed focal point to a more improvisational structure where people's roles are fluid and always shifting. So in this context, DAO may help to give shape to an improvised conversation, but we also acknowledge in our group conversation that over-formalization could be an issue here. It could also help to sustain ongoing reflection. This is something that we think that the technology could potentially help with. And of course, keeping a log of history that informs but does not automate the process of decision making. Ensemble, however, at present does not want to or cannot address the issue of shared language and trust. If a group of people who come together without a basis of trust already and a shared language, Ensemble, the way that we are thinking about it now, it's not something that it can potentially address. We do not want to formalize rules, and we are not about restricting sharing and reuse. We took DAO as an opportunity to reflect on flexibility possibilities, but of course at present, solutions using other tools are also feasible. So some of the ideas that are specific to our Ensemble DAO, which are notes from 2 recent meetings, are that we want to pool resources that have been given into this research, deposit them for a future commission so that this project will continue. We spoke about periodic and automatic trigger of vote on stake so that the conversation about value of work is sustained over a period of time. We log work as a reference for collective decision, but not automation. And this is related to periodic vote. We revisit the value of action over time and when key decisions have to be made. Now, to get more serious, I've been asked to comment on the local context in Hong Kong. I think automatically, perhaps the NSL, which is the National Security Law, is something that is on people's mind. But it is difficult to see how, I mean, personally speaking, it's difficult to see how DAO might aid in that. But something else actually is worth mentioning, which is that since in 1999, the government in Hong Kong commissioned a consultation report that basically meant that arts organizations that used to have less formal structures transitioned into a company structure, and this transition was completed by the year 2000. This later also became the norm for all arm's-length funded arts group on organizational funding under the Hong Kong Arts Development Council, which CMHK is currently under. Recently, there has been many reports that groups, not only art groups, but also community organizations, are finding it difficult to obtain not-for-profit organization registrations, open a company account, or register as a society. Society registration is the easiest to obtain, but it is inadequate in some forms of funding under the HAB and the ADC. This has become a potential area of restriction for art groups or new communities that want to form and self-organize. So potentially a technology like DAO could help open up a space that is between formalized collaboration and informal organization, to give informal organization some sort of collaborative structure, perhaps. And this is all I've got, and thank you, everyone.
Samson, thank you so much for that. I just have like a kind of quick question, but before I go on, I realized in my interest to move forward with this, I actually forgot to describe myself as well. So I'm a white woman with very short hair, green eyes, freckles, and dark top. So Samson, I think that you really kind of pulled together the ways in which artistic forms are so tendrilled, like not only within their own practice of language, but also how they meditate between people and users, but also how that is directly sitting inside another system, being the environment. And so I would just like to ask you, in a way, like, how does it feel to marshal the chaotic and multivalent flows of artistic creation, be that visual, psychic, historic, heritage, political, into a system of kind of hard rules and relationship? And I know that you've just touched on that, like from a local context of the Hong Kong art world, but I just maybe want to open that more inside like your own personal and collective practice.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Penny. I think it is very difficult, and it brings up a lot of questions. In the conversation that the four of us have, in the earlier phases, when I personally actually was more interested in the formalizing aspect, then we also realized that some of those relationships are informal and actually difficult to bring into a formalized structure. So actually having that conversation is useful in that way. It's a very sort of, it's a good focal point to probe some of the things that some of the assumptions that we might have. About different systems though, I think, again, referring to my, the local context here, for example, I think, for example, already there exist some very formal structures that is mandated by arts funding, and they continue to exist, but having semi-formal or improvisational structures existing in parallel, they do not really take away from each other. And like I said, there might be a need to consider something in between right now. If it's going to be the case that in the future, organizations that are less formal will be barred from public funding, then I think the technology now is still quite far away. But if it does come one point where the technology is able to hold together groups of people over a kind of semi-formal structure that exists in parallel to these more rigid ones, I think that could be productive.
Thank you so much. We really covered a lot of ground there. That's fantastic. I think it's important now that we move to Andrew at Meta Objects, who's going to present the kind of technical perspective on the work they've been doing. Andrew, maybe you could start by describing yourself.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a white male, blonde, short, stubbly beard, dark check shirt, So yeah, I'm going to go through the kind of day-to-day interaction that project participants have with the DAO. Let me just get the screen share. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So yes, to set the scene for our visually impaired users, anything relating to the real world, so the real participants and their creative endeavors, are represented by these beautiful, indescribable improvised drawings by Samson. And anything relating to the mechanics of the DAO happening on the blockchain are represented by that classic 90s PowerPoint clip art. So to begin, the first phase of any project in this DAO is the project startup phase. That represents the participants agreeing on the initial project structure, which we call the bylaws. It includes agreeing to a share of the project based on the amount of work a participant is thinking of taking on, seeding the initial project funds if the project needs funds to operate, and any other potential rules. So the participants on the left here propose the bylaws on the right, which are initial project shares, project funds, and any other rules. So when the participants are ready, they hold a vote to confirm these bylaws and to start the project. The project then enters the working phase. Participants can make a log of their work for the project as they're doing it, such as composing, improvising, instrument making, conducting, propagating, and also the outcome of this work. Maybe it's helping to seed the project, seeding, or cushion the project, cushioning, nudging the project, or enabling other project members. This goes into the project's log of work, here represented by a log. As the nature of people's work in the project might change, maybe they are taking on more work or have had to take on less work. At regular intervals, the participants are shown our log of the work so far and asked if they feel that the project shares should be adjusted. Maybe someone deserves more shares, or maybe because someone has had to step back from the project, they agree to give the other participants some of their shares. Participants vote to confirm any changes. So in the top left, we have participants who, moving around the circle, are shown the log of work, who then propose changes in the project share, who then vote on these changes. And then if the vote succeeds, the project shares are amended, and then that goes back to the participant share. If a participant has an expense, such as purchasing supplies or any other costs, at any time they can request funding from the project. Participants vote to approve this, and the project funds are transferred. So the participant on the top left again, going around the circle, if they must purchase supplies, then they request funds from the project. Participants vote on this request, and then if the vote succeeds, project funds are distributed back to the participants. Participants can also create resolutions if they just want to say something. for the project. So the participant going around the circle, wants to say something. They write a text resolution, which is just a short piece of text or a short speech. Participants vote to adopt this resolution, and then if the resolution is adopted, then it is added to the DAO. At any time, the project can also admit a new participant. Starting on the top left, going down diagonally, participants would vote to admit a new member. They agree on a share of the project to give to the new participant. And then if that vote succeeds, the participant is finally added to the rest of the participants on the project. There are other types of participation that the DAO supports as well. The participants can, of course, join in with just the same creative work that the existing participants perform. So, for example, the participant on the left here could be involved in composing or conducting, improvising, instrument making, any other potential creative work that the project is doing. But there's also other kinds of participants that we are imagining. One of these is institutions joining so that they can put on a performance of the work. The project may ask for payment for the performance rights. If this is agreed by a vote of the existing participants, then the new participating institution pays into the project and can put on a performance. So the participant in the top left here is an institution who wants to perform the works. They would pay for the performance rights. The participants vote to accept this. And then the new participating institution is given the performance. Whenever the project receives such payments, it is distributed to all participants based on the project share as what we've called dividends. So the project on the left here is receiving a payment here. Then it's distributed to the participants on the right as a dividend based on the share of the project that the participants have. Another type of potential new participant is what we're calling a propagator. These participants may not necessarily get involved in the creative side of the project, but instead want to support the project by spreading the works to a wider audience. If existing participants vote to admit them, then they are given a share of the project. With this share, propagators are rewarded for helping the project receive more performances and thus more dividends. So the participant in the top left wants to support the project by spreading the work. So they propagate the project and they attract new paid performances. Then more dividends are generated for all the participants, and that dividend also goes back to the propagators who helped spread the project. So those are just a few examples of participation. Because the project structure is flexible, the participants decide the role of these new participants coming in. So any combination of involvement is supported by this DAO. Finally, these are the advantages of running the DAO on a blockchain smart contract. So there's transparency of decision making. All the work logs, all the vote outcomes, all the decisions and resolutions are publicly available on the blockchain. So you have a complete transparent running of the project. Because the smart contract holds the funds and only releases funds when votes have passed. So you have trusted handling of funds. Because the blockchain is immutable, all the previous decisions can be verified as true and correct. So you have an immutable record of the project. And finally, because the smart contract runs on the blockchain, it has no dependencies on any individuals. So it can continue to run without maintenance. So even if the person who sets the project up initially leaves the project, it will still carry on working on the blockchain indefinitely. So the project runs autonomously. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap up the presentation session with a conversation between Ashley and Massimiliano. And Penny and I may join you after your first exchange, just to ensure that we kind of integrating all the conversations that we've been having, and we don't run before we run out of time. So yeah, let's just pick up on a few questions from the audience. We have the question about where the initial seed funding comes from, what blockchain does the contract run on, and who pays for the gas fees, and a question about expression of appreciation from Linda, and a question about whether we're using quadratic voting among participants. But first, let's hand over to Massimiliano and Ashley.
Okay, thank you. So I am a white male with dark hair and a blue shirt. So I came into this project as an anthropologist who works at the intersection between art and political economy. So my interest here was to contribute by kind of reflecting on a broader issue of value in art and on power dynamics, especially in complex human collaborations. So in conversation also with Ashley, we thought that there are three main aspects that are interesting from this broader anthropological point of view. One is that this DAO allows us to reflect and allows to be a form of prefiguration of a social relationship. And in this case, a prefiguration of a collective that comes together as an aggregate of very unique individuals, as collective space where differences are valorized. But also think about this as a kind of, through the notion of Motte and Harney, as a sort of undercommon. So as a gray area where different rationalities, different languages and different ways of working and come together slightly outside the mainstream, at the margins of the center, and where there is not yet a language or a mode of enunciation or of accounting for each other. So we're thinking about the Ensemble as a space both of listening and improvisation, of composition and refusal, and of solidarity and care and partial identifications. And the second aspect is about the relationship between art and commodity, which is, or art and money, which is obviously underlying several of these DAOs projects. And I think what's important is not so much to think about art as a commodity, that is to say how to, let's say, give a monetary value to what we're doing, but the opposite, to think about commodities as art projects. So if we look at DAOs, they're just functional tools They are tools for governance, for distributing share. But our interest is to try to think about value creation as a process of contamination of the market with different kinds of social relations. And also thinking that in non-capitalist system, money are the media with a strong aesthetic component. And so how that can come into the process of configuration and prefiguration. And so art, in this case, our DAO is a space to think about our labor, our skills, our organization from a socialized and also very concrete point of view, as opposed to the abstraction of money. And a practical example is when we thought about how we account for our work, we thought about different, either hours or numbers. And then we thought that either we didn't need that system, or we could think about, as Samson was saying, I am thinking through action types, or thinking of having a process of qualitative annotation, a sort of collecting archive that could constitute a parallel informal dimension to the system. And lastly, the important component is, for me, it's a multimodality, not only the idea of multidisciplinarity. So precisely in terms of knowledge production and how this conversation between images, sounds, and text can become themselves part of the score and can expand the value of what we are doing. And thinking the multimodality is not only a technical or aesthetic or intellectual issue, it's also a touch upon issue of power, of democracy, and thinking what Samson was just saying, thinking who is the learner who's teaching, thinking different ways of approaching images, of approaching value. And again, here I'm thinking about some contribution from the Black radical tradition, the idea of apticality of images, or the idea of looking at what happens outside and around images. So I think about multimodality is really as a way of shifting perspective and of translating and caring for each other. And of course, the challenges are to shift from the level of the metaphor to the level of making the system functional and working. So yes, I'm gonna leave it to Ashley.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Now. Yeah, so I am an Asian woman with short hair, dark hair, and brown eyes. And I'm wearing a blue shirt or dress. So essentially, this DAO was interesting for me because I was just finished my PhD exploring economies of art and technology. And we had some conversations and some alignments in thinking in terms of our conversations with Mao. So I thought I could contribute to this project more on a kind of conceptual and theoretical level. And starting to think more about art making as a process, rather than concentrating on the final and complete artwork. How do we sustain kind of ongoing art making activities? So it's not so much concentrated on the individual author, or it's more about the collective process of making. So the final artwork is less important, though the final artwork does feed into the, like, what if it's sold, for instance, the proceeds could be fed back into the collective process to seed the DAO, to enable further collaborations and evolutions of the project. So it's more about thinking about artistic production as a creative process that's constantly evolving and changing and constantly being reenacted and reperformed. So we value things like commissioning, which allows and enables artists and people to come together to produce and make work. So any kind of funding we receive will part of it is intended to be fed back to continue any future developments of the project. So the DAO is, I mean, Samson uses the analogy of farming, like you place seeds and it's intended for outcomes in the future, but it's the collective futures. It starts to move away from a kind of individual origin or author of the work. So the DAO also allows for tracing and tracking of work and activities that may also be like unpaid or the invisible forms of labor that happen behind the scenes. And even things like researching and grant writing and things like that, it starts to make visible some of the processes and also the various different roles that we all play in a project, which change over time, and we're constantly evolving our roles. And this is also how we see our role at Method Objects, as we've also been collaborating with Samson in his works. So it allowed us to think about how we define and categorize work, which becomes the kind of important in terms of how we value different forms of labor, such as, you know, often we think of hard skills versus soft skills and how we value maybe hard skills, which are maybe more masculine, and soft skills as more feminine. So this becomes kind of a political aspect that comes out of this, which we will continue to negotiate and think about further. And lastly, I think the working on this DAO together has allowed us to all reflect on our roles and how we collaborate together in these kind of multidisciplinary projects, to also rethink our roles within these projects, and to think about ways for enabling and sustaining these collaborative artistic practices.
Thank you so much. So we're coming to the end, and I'd like to just read Ryan's question, because I think it's good. It surfaces a topic that's been running through. So Ryan says, it's interesting when you mentioned that the structure you have does not really work when there is no initially built trust. Seeing that one can nominate a new participant, is there a process as well of perhaps putting a motion of removing someone for whatever reason? So there's these kind of questions of what sits all around the technology. But I'd really like to maybe wrap up to hear your reflections on I think this particular moment. Like there's so much attention at the moment to work going on in the NFT kind of, I think of it as the other blockchain art world, the art world of kind of crypto art and NFTs, and specifically what your DAO does and how it relates to the kind of status of art as a commodity or as a speculative object, as a kind of financial speculative object. Maybe Ashley or Mal could, I don't know, someone might be burning to answer this, but.
Ashley, do you want to start?
I mean, I think it really, this DAO, our DAO starts to think less of like a fixed commodity of the art object that can be sold. It's never, like, we like to think of it more as like sustaining cultural activity that's ongoing and constantly evolving, rather than like a solid, like complete commodity that can be easily sold and monetized. And, you know, that's kind of not the part we want to so much emphasize. We want to emphasize the process of making, collaborative making. So obviously DAO, I mean, NFTs could be relevant in certain parts of if we had one part of the project that was final and complete and then selling it in a way, but yeah, we're more interested in the kind of evolving nature of an artwork.
I guess I was interested in, I think Mao used the term kind of contaminating the value flows. So I'm just interested to understand whether you think that this work has actually a more kind of, yeah, whether it can reroute some of the kind of value flows that are currently so dominant in the kind of high art markets and the high art world.
Yeah, I was meaning that, and I think that the speculation is actually a two-way word. So in a way, this contamination could work either by let's say deflating, let's say the financial based idea of value, but also inflating it. And so it's a difficult, let's say, equilibrium to strike. And so the very notion of the speculation of art, it's empowering, but also problematic because it creates all sorts of different kinds of forks out and all sorts of different speculation. I guess what characterizes our group is that we are aware that there is the formal and the informal of keeping these two systems together and to decide what is worth to formalize and what's decided what is not worth to, what is better to keep informal, let's say, as Samson also was saying.
Thank you. I just want to also jump in with the last few questions that are left in the chat now. So Chris said, thank you for the fascinating conversation. Just a question about language used in the project. Was it easy for participating artists to familiarize themselves with the vocabulary and terms used and borrowed from the tech world? And another question from Brandon. Do you see this project more as another artistic model of a way of working, also a kind of speculative object, or something that is supposed to be functional for real-world day-to-day operations? I will just leave a little bit of space in case any of you want to jump in on this.
So, I mean, actually, the terms used were come up by Samson, so they're not actually tech world terms, at least in the case of what we imagine the participants doing. And, yeah, Samson, I don't know if you want to say anything about it.
Actually, I want to just very briefly comment on the last question that Mao and Ashley were addressing. I mean, earlier we were having a conversation about sort of, well, if we are admitting a participant, but we are not, let's say, quote unquote, like, people could still access the material online and it's elsewhere and we are not tracking it, then it becomes so then having new participant in a conversation, meaning that they get to be a part of this conversation. They get to, say, learn, like Andrew would be teaching them the code of a particular aspect of the work. Mao and Ashley would be sort of the sounding board. In the same way that we've been, we all come from very different perspectives and lineages, and we've sort of, I feel like we have all sort of evolved in this process of trying to think through this. So I think, that's how I think about sort of the relationship.
Thank you, Samson. And thank you, all of you, for this session. And please, for members of the audience, feel free to get further into contact with Ensemble for any follow-ups. And if you have any more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat right now, and we will actually also pass them on. We've been kind of creating an archive of questions that we're sharing with all of the prototype teams in order to think further about these both speculative and physical potentialities of Artworld prototypes. We'd also like to thank the amazing Goethe Institute team for their work on this. Throughout almost 2 years of conversations. For our very last session next week, myself and Ruth will actually meet with Francesca Garvin, who is an art theorist and critical thinker on modes in the art world. And we will have a sort of wrap up, but I guess also it will create many more questions, a reflection on the Artworld DAO prototypes and the current state of DAOs in the art world. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you for the last session next week, same time. Thank you all so much.
you.